Hey guys, and welcome back to another lesson. I want to talk to you about borrowing chords this time. And we're going to just jump straight into it, and I'm going to show you how you can basically combine chords from two different scales to create interesting melodies and progressions. We're going to work in the A minor scale, the Aeolian scale. And when you look at this scale, you can start by building a triad on the root, which is an A minor, and then just move it up. And you can get a selection of chords built on this Aeolian minor scale. So you can have A minor, B diminished, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, and then again A minor. And you can put these chords together to create interesting and meaningful chord progressions. For example, you can do an F to a G to an A minor. So this would be a motion from the 6th degree, or the chord built on the 6th degree, to the 7, to a G major, to a 1, to an A minor. Or you can do a 4-5-1. So a D minor, to an E minor, to an A minor. Now you can enlarge this collection of chords you can work with by borrowing from parallel scales. A parallel scale is any other scale that's built on the same root, in this case an A. And the most common interchange happens between the minor scales and major scales. So the A major scale being. Now we can do the exact same sort of exercise. We can build a triad on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th degrees of the A major scale. This would be an A major chord, and now we can move it up the scale. And get another collection of chords. A major, B minor, C sharp minor, D major, E major, F sharp minor, and G sharp diminished, before we get back to our root chord, the A major. And the whole point of borrowing chords is basically just the simple idea that when you play, let's say, an A minor, you can borrow any of the chords that come from the parallel major scale, from the A major. And I want to show you a few different examples of how this is done. So let's start by looking at a 4-5-1 progression. And we're going to be in A minor, so a 4 would be a D minor, a 5 would be an E minor, and a 1 would be an A minor. And you can build interesting melodies on this. Even without going to more complex chords like, I don't know, let's say a D minor 11 to an E minor 11 and then to an A minor 11. Now we can try and swap any of these chords for their borrowed, or borrow any of these chords from the parallel major. So let's say we can do a 4-5-1 but borrow the 5 from the A major. This would mean that instead of playing a D minor to an E minor to an A minor, we will play a D minor to an E major to an A minor. And this has a very different sound to it. Now just playing triads here. It might sound maybe a little bit bland, but when you start mixing it up with higher degrees, let's say a D minor 11 to an E, basically an E major, but we're going to make it an E dominant. So E dominant 7 with a sharp 9 and a sharp 5. And then an A minor 9. Now we can do the exact same thing with the 4. So it's playing a 4-5-1. We can borrow the 4 from the A major parallel. So now we're going to have a D major to in E minor to an A minor. We can even borrow the 4 and the 5. D major, E major to an A minor. This has kind of a medieval sound to it, I guess. And you can basically use higher degrees and make it sound much more interesting. Let's say the D major to an E major, again an E dominant 7, they become dominant chords. And then some sort of A minor 11. Let's do another example. Let's do a 2-5-1. So a 2-5-1 in the A minor scale is a B diminished or a B diminished 7 to an A minor, to an E minor or E minor 7, then to an A minor. It's a very nice kind of melancholic sound to it. Sometimes instead of an A minor, you'll play an F major. So kind of a nice sad sound to it, but we can borrow some of the chords from some of the other scales. For example, we can play a 2-5-1 and borrow the 5 from the A major scale. So now we're going to have an E major. And I guess for me this has kind of a bossa nova connotation. But it can really serve any purpose. You can also borrow the 2 from the major scale. Let's borrow the 2 and the 5 together. So we're going to have a B minor 7 to an E7 or an E major or an E dominant 7 to an A minor 7. Now you don't have to substitute specific chords in your progression, but you could just add the borrowed chords or just mix them in pretty much any order you'd like. This is something you need to experiment with because you're going to find out that some of the progressions are going to be to your liking and some aren't. And what I want to do in the remaining time is maybe highlight a few interesting progressions that I personally like and you might like as well. So something to think about. So if we start from the root, from an A minor or an A minor 7 in this case, I kind of like the sound of playing or borrowing the 2 from the major scale, which would be a B minor. In this case I'm playing like a B minor 11. I can sus it as well, so play a B9 sus 4. I'm just moving the 3 to a 4. And this leads kind of nicely into a 6 in the original scale, which is an F major. It's kind of a modern R&B sound to it. Which I kind of like. The 6, the F major, in the original minor scale, leads kind of nicely into the 4 in the borrowed chords, which would be a D major, or a D dominant 7, or D dominant 9. So, putting it all together, so as you've seen, I've borrowed some of the chords, but I've kind of stayed in the minor character of the original scale. Another couple of things I like is, and this is kind of an interesting, if you play in the A minor scale, or the minor, any minor scale you'd like, but we're going to play in the A minor here. There are two borrowed chords which, if you borrow, they kind of have initially a jarring sound, kind of they subvert the expectations of the listener, but they resolve quite nicely back into the minor scale. And these are the 6th degrees and the 3rd degrees of the major scale. So these will be the F sharp minor chord, which leads quite nicely into the F major, and then a C sharp minor chord, which leads quite nicely into a D minor. So for example, you can play an A minor, right? So I'm playing an A minor, and then an F sharp minor, and then an F major. It has kind of mysterious sound to it. Of course, the borrowed chords need to fit in with the melody you're playing, otherwise it doesn't make sense, but that's true for any chord that you choose to harmonize a melody, whether it's from the scale or from outside the scale. So. Have a listen to the borrowed minor third from the A major scale. So that's the that's the C sharp minor, which leads to a D minor, to an E minor, to an A minor. So I could play something like C sharp minor, D minor, E minor, A minor. The C sharp minor itself, by the way, leads into the F sharp minor. That's kind of 3/6 in the parallel A major scale. So you can have a progression where you do, let's say, an A minor, so I'm doing a 3 minor, 6 minor in the A major scale, and then a 6 from the A minor scale, back in the minor scale now, and then maybe a G and an A minor. So borrowing chords really opens up the palette of chords that you can choose from when you play a melody or harmonize a melody or create a progression. That's kind of a neat trick to get used to just going back and forth between these scales. And there are no hard rules for this. There's no rule that says, well, you have to use this degree or borrow this degree before that degree. It's really just a question of listening to different examples like I've shown you here and deciding which ones sound good to you and you'd like to emulate and which don't. So I hope I've given you some ideas and open up your mind to thinking in this way and that you've learned something interesting, and I will see you next time.